The man knelt on the cold concrete floor, using his bare hands to wipe up a puddle of urine beside a folding cot. No one told him to do it. No one even knew his name. But in those chaotic days, in that makeshift storm shelter, there was something about him that made everything around seem to slow down. The hurricane that swept through the coastal town 3 days earlier had left behind streets buried in mud, roofs torn apart, and hundreds of people with no place to sleep. The community center had been turned into a temporary refuge. Every morning, pickup trucks arrived loaded with food, blankets, and people. All kinds of people. And among them was Noel Carter. No one knew where he came from. There was nothing remarkable about him. A faded gray hoodie, worn-out jeans, and a pair of soaked sneakers. He didn't say much beyond his name and a simple line, "I took some time off work." Yet within 2 days, everyone recognized him. The quiet man who was always there when needed. Riley Quinn noticed him from the start. She was used to people who came and went, the ones who took a few volunteer photos for social media and disappeared right after. But Noel was different. He never stood near a camera, never gave speeches, never stepped back when there was dirty work to be done. She knew nothing about his past, only that he could fold blankets like a soldier, that he could calm down an out-of-control addict with just a few quiet words, and that he knew how to listen, not the nod-along, sympathetic kind, but the kind of real listening that carried no judgment. Riley, 28, was a social worker. She'd once had everything: a degree from a prestigious university, a guaranteed spot in the family business, a career path paved smooth ahead of her. Until the day she chose to walk away from it all, to follow what her family called a waste, standing among the homeless, the addicts, and the abandoned children. Her parents disowned her after she moved out of their luxury apartment, choosing instead to live alone in a shabby rented house and work for a nonprofit that barely paid a living wage. But Riley never regretted it. She knew what it was like to sleep beside an abused single mother. She had held a child in her arms as he lost his father to an overdose. Noel didn't know any of that, but the way he looked at people the world had forgotten, it was the same as Riley's, as if they shared some unspoken, unbreakable reason deep inside. One afternoon, when the rain had finally stopped, Riley saw him in the storage room, working with a teenage boy known for petty theft. The kid was the most troublesome one in the shelter, yet he stayed quiet next to Noel. She walked over and handed Noel the list for the 3rd supply round. "Got time to help me sort more blankets?" she asked. Noel nodded. No questions, no complaints. As they stacked the blankets onto the shelves, Riley asked casually, "What did you used to do?" He paused for a few seconds, not hesitating, just choosing his words. "Things that made other people richer," he said quietly. She looked at him. It wasn't the answer she expected, but it wasn't a lie either. He spoke like someone who had walked away from something big, not because he failed, but because he no longer believed it was right. That night, in the makeshift food line, they worked side by side again. Riley stood at the front. Noel handed out meals. They didn't talk much, but everyone passing through felt a strange calm in the way the two of them moved together. When they finished, Noel picked up a jacket someone had left behind. He folded it neatly and placed it on the blanket box, as if it still belonged to someone. Riley watched him for a moment, then said softly, "You know, most of the people here have been forgotten by the world." Noel answered without turning around, "Not everyone who disappears wants to be forgotten." His words left her silent. She didn't know who he was, but in that moment she knew this much. Maybe she had just shaken hands with a man who once carried the whole world and now was holding on to the one piece he still wanted to keep. The next afternoon, in the temporary storage area, Riley and Noel were assigned to sort through boxes of newly delivered food supplies. She was labeling expiration dates when Noel quietly pulled a crate of bottled water from the corner. He unscrewed the lid, checking each bottle carefully, eyes focused as if he were doing something far more important than inspecting relief goods. "What did you do before?" Riley asked, not out of curiosity, but just to fill the silence hanging in the room. "Tech," Noel said without looking up. "I used to run a startup." "What kind of field?" "User data analytics. We helped platforms understand their customers' consumption habits." Riley froze for a few seconds, not impressed, just struck by how far that world was from this one. "And then the pandemic hit. The team fell apart, investors pulled out, I burned out, the company and myself." He said it like he was talking about someone else's story. Calm, without bitterness. But his eyes couldn't hide the exhaustion. So why come here? Because I needed to find something more human, less numbers, less proving myself. His words made Riley's hands stop moving. She didn't know exactly what they stirred in her, only that they made her want to say the things she'd kept buried for years. You know, she said quietly, my whole life used to be scheduled. Prestigious school, the perfect internship, getting groomed to take over a department someday, everything laid out. Noelle stayed silent, never interrupting. One winter night, she continued, I went out with a new relief worker. We found a woman dead inside her car. She was holding her dog tight, like she thought she'd wake up the next morning. When I saw the hospital ID bracelet on her wrist, I realized she used to be a client of my family's insurance company. Noelle didn't say a word, just gave a small nod. Riley took a deep breath. The next morning, I quit. There was no applause, no admiring looks, but the silence between them said enough, that not everyone came here out of pity for others. Some came to save themselves. That evening, the center organized a mobile food drive at 3 locations on the city's outskirts. Riley and Noelle were assigned to the second team. They drove an old truck to an abandoned neighborhood left in ruins after the storm, a place now crowded with addicts and the homeless. As soon as they stopped, a thin man staggered toward them. His eyes were dull, his jacket caked with mud. Fake, he shouted in Riley's face as she held out a meal box. You think a couple of cookies makes up for anything? Riley instinctively stepped back. Years in social work had taught her how to manage fear, but never how to erase it. Before she could react, Noelle stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't escalate. I get it, he said calmly. If you need to yell, yell at me. The man froze, caught off guard by the response. But if you're hungry, take the meal. No one needs to know why. Noelle set the box down on the nearby steps and walked away. Not hurried, not afraid. Riley watched him, something in the way he handled it making her unable to look away. It wasn't the hero saves the girl kind of moment. It was the kind of response from someone who'd been yelled at before, who understood the pain of being misunderstood, and refused to react from defensiveness. When they finished distributing the meals, they sat on the truck's step, sipping water. Riley tilted her head, studying him. Have you ever lost control? She asked. Yeah, he said without hesitation. And I hurt a lot of people because of it. Riley didn't ask anything more, but from that night on she began to see Noelle differently. Not as the quiet man mopping the floor in the corner anymore, but as someone carrying something far deeper, something she couldn't quite name. All she knew was that she wanted to understand it. In the days following the food drive, Riley found herself noticing Noelle more often. Not in a romantic way, but with a quiet curiosity, a subtle suspicion she couldn't put into words. There was something that didn't quite add up between his unassuming appearance and the way he carried himself in every situation. One morning, while sorting through boxes of supplies, an older volunteer leaned toward her and whispered, "That Noel guy, he looks familiar, doesn't he? There's something about his presence. I swear I've seen him on TV before. Maybe he used to be somebody important. I lived up north once, you know, the fancy area." Riley laughed it off, pretending not to care, but the thought lingered. After lunch, as they folded maps of the new distribution areas together, she watched him quietly. Noel didn't look at the map like everyone else did. He didn't flip it upside down or ask for directions. He folded it into 3 perfectly even sections, the edges straight as if measured with a ruler. She tested him by asking about a point on the map. Instead of answering, he turned to another volunteer and asked, "Do you think this route's easier, or should we go west instead?" It wasn't because he didn't know. It was because he wanted others to have a voice in the decision. She began to notice the way he spoke, never clumsy, never hesitant. None of the usual, I think maybe pauses people often used. Every sentence was precise, complete, trimmed of anything unnecessary. It wasn't the speech of someone trying to live simply. It was the speech of someone who used to talk to people who didn't have time to listen. That weekend, the center hosted a small fundraising event. Everyone gathered in the community room, warm yellow lights glowing, tables and chairs packed close together. Longtime supporters, a few local donors, and the core staff all took turns sharing their stories of working with the organization. Riley was invited to speak on behalf of the social work team. Public speaking was never her strength, especially not with 100 eyes focused on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. She skimmed through her notes, then glanced toward the audience. Noel stood at the back of the room, near the door. The light didn't reach him, but his eyes were fixed on her. Not encouraging, not frowning, just steady. Riley took a deep breath and greeted the crowd, but her voice cracked. A few whispers rippled through the room. She glanced toward the organizers, unsure, but no one moved to help. Then Noel stepped forward. Not rushing, not flustered. He gently took the microphone from her hand and turned to face the room. "I used to run a room much bigger than this one," he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "And I used to think being a good speaker meant convincing people to listen to you. But after a few months here, I've learned something. No one needs a speech to believe kindness is real. What they need is someone who actually stays when everything starts to fall apart." The room fell silent. He turned to Riley and handed her the microphone. "That someone's already standing right next to you," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. Riley stepped forward again, and this time her voice didn't shake. She didn't read from her notes. She simply told the story of a child she'd been working with at the center. It ended with a short thank you, simple but sincere. After the event, a few people came up to shake Riley's hand, but most of them turned to each other, whispering, "Who was that man? What did he used to do?" She heard it all, but didn't answer. That night, while cleaning up, she saw Noel tying up an extension cord by the window. The light cast across his face, and for the first time, Riley found herself wondering, how could someone who could silence a whole room choose to live in a place where no one even asked his name? Why was he here? It couldn't just be because he was taking time off work. She was sure of that. But she didn't ask. Not yet. She knew some cracks couldn't be pressed too hard. They had to open on their own. Maybe, if she was patient enough, they would. And if her instincts were right, Noel wasn't just another man passing through this place. 2 days after the fundraiser, the rain came pouring down again. The mobile blanket station at the old warehouse near the docks was more crowded than ever. Rain leaked through the metal roof, dripping onto the freezing concrete floor, the air thick with dampness and the scent of sweat that hadn't had time to dry. Riley and Noel were assigned to the night shift, handing out blankets and coats to those still without a place to sleep. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, each of them busy with the endless line of people, shivering, exhausted, eyes hollow. But Riley couldn't stop her mind from circling back to the question that had haunted her since the night Noel spoke. When the last person left, she sat down on the stone steps behind the warehouse. The wind howled through the cracks, blowing her hair against her cheek. Noel brought her a cup of weak coffee and sat beside her, close enough to feel his presence, but far enough to keep it unintrusive. She turned toward him, rain flickering through the eaves, her voice quiet but steady. "Who were you?" Noel stayed silent for a long time, not the kind of silence that dodges a question, but the kind that wrestles with whether you're ready to open a door long sealed by dust. "I used to run a data company," he said at last, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fence. "Over 200 employees, headquarters in a big city. They called me the guy who could see the future through numbers." Riley didn't interrupt. "When the pandemic hit," he continued, "cash dried up, investors panicked. We held late-night meetings, crunching every possible scenario. And in the end, I chose to cut people, to protect profit, to protect valuation, to protect what they called market confidence." He paused, a dry, bitter laugh escaping. "On the layoff list that day was my sister." Riley turned to look at him. For the first time, Noel's face wasn't calm or detached. His brows knit together, his jaw tightened, the mask finally slipping. "She was the reason I started the company," he said. "She believed data could make public services better, healthcare, education, all of it. But after the layoffs, she lost her home, her insurance. I sent money, called her, tried everything to fix it, but she wouldn't take any of it. 3 months later, I got a call from a small hospital. She'd had a panic attack, collapsed, and didn't make it." Riley realized she'd been gripping her coffee cup so tightly her hands were trembling. Noel sat still. No apology, no excuse. Just one quiet sentence, barely more than a whisper. "I built an empire and couldn't save one person." She lowered her head. The tears that welled up weren't out of pity, but from understanding, the kind that came from knowing exactly what it felt like to think if I had just made one different choice, maybe they'd still be here. She carried that feeling for 3 years. "My best friend," she said, her voice trembling. "We grew up together. She was forced into med school, even though all she ever wanted was to make documentaries. I watched her slowly break under the pressure, first losing her dream, then losing herself. Noel turned to her. One day, she texted me, "If I ever disappear, don't blame yourself. Just remember, I really wanted to live as myself." I never replied to that message, and I never got another chance. The rain began to fall harder. Neither of them moved. The wind swept through the hallway, carrying the smell of wet trash and human breath. They didn't touch. They didn't speak words of comfort. But in the space between them, something had shifted. Noel pulled an old handkerchief from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. He didn't say a word. Riley took it without protest. They sat there like that. Two strangers, each carrying a death they could never forget. But instead of pushing each other away, they drew quietly closer, bound by a kind of honesty that needed no name, no facade. For the first time since meeting him, Riley stopped wondering who he was, what he'd done, or where he came from. For the first time, she saw him clearly. Not through his past, but through his loss. And in that moment, she realized, what made her trust someone wasn't that they'd never fallen, but that they were brave enough not to run from the thing that once broke them. 3 days after that rainy night, Noel still showed up for his shifts at the distribution site. But Riley could tell he wasn't quite the same. He smiled less, spoke less, yet somehow seemed lighter, as if laying down the secret he'd carried had given him room to breathe again. She didn't ask anything more. They simply worked side by side in a quiet that felt easy. Then, on the 4th day, Noel didn't show up. At first, Riley thought he'd just taken a day off. By the 5th day, the other volunteers started asking around, but no one knew where he'd gone. No contact info, no address. His volunteer record was nearly blank. A man who had arrived, helped, and then disappeared as if he'd never been there at all. Riley couldn't explain why the emptiness hit so hard. She'd seen countless people come and go, but with Noel, something had carved its way into her. And now it was gone, pulled out without even a goodbye. She found herself back in a familiar place, left in the middle of something once again. A week later, on Sunday night, as she was checking her work emails, a new message appeared. No name, just a strange address, and a subject line that read, "An invitation, if you still believe I'm real." Riley clicked it open. Inside was a plain message, no decoration, no fancy formatting, just a short paragraph, a space newly opened. A place without judgment, only new beginnings. If you still believe art can heal, I hope you'll come. Tuesday, 5 p.m., ground floor, the renovated warehouse near Central Station. There was no signature. But she didn't need one. She knew it was Noel. On Tuesday afternoon, Riley walked to the address in the email. The old warehouse had been abandoned for years, once used for storage before being flooded in the early season storm. Now, new glass doors had been installed, the front painted white, and a wooden sign hung above the gate. Artworks Revival, a community healing space. She pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of fresh paint, flooded with natural light pouring through the tall glass windows. The space was wide and open, divided into small corners, painting tables, easels, a quiet reading nook, a wall lined with framed artworks. Each painting carried its own style, from clumsy brushstrokes to refined technique, but they all shared one thing, an unfiltered honesty. A middle-aged woman approached and handed Riley a brochure. At the top was a brand new logo, Carter & Co. Restorative Fund. Riley froze, her heartbeat quickened. She skimmed down the introduction. A non-profit initiative dedicated to giving underprivileged youth access to art, helping them recover emotionally and reintegrate into society through art programs, training, and long-term mentorship. Primary sponsor, Noel Carter. She sat down on a wooden chair by the window, her eyes wandering without focus. The man she'd worked alongside for weeks, the one who swept floors, folded blankets, poured coffee, turned out to be the person behind all of this. Not anonymous, not halfway, but someone who had built it. From the ground up. A group of teenagers walked in, backpacks slung over their shoulders, faces bright with excitement. She heard them calling to each other, pointing at different corners with eager curiosity. A young boy sat down at a painting table, dipped his brush in color, and began to paint with a focus so pure it nearly broke her heart. Riley felt her throat tighten. She turned back to the logo once more. Carter & Co. For the first time, the name stood there openly. Not hiding, not denying. And what stunned Riley wasn't just that Noel was the founder. It was that he had done all this not to be seen, but so that a group of kids who'd never been called by name could finally have a place to belong. After walking around the exhibition space, Riley was invited to attend the official opening ceremony in the center's main hall. She stood at the back of the large room among dozens of others finding their seats. Under the soft yellow lights, the setting remained simple, true to the spirit of the place, yet carried a quiet sense of dignity. When everyone had settled, a small door beside the stage opened. Noel stepped out into the light, and for the first time in all the weeks she'd known him, Riley saw him wearing a suit. A perfectly fitted black jacket. A plain white shirt, no tie. He walked slowly, unhurried, without any grand introduction from the organizers. He stood before the microphone, letting his gaze sweep across the room. The children's paintings hung proudly beside wildflower arrangements. He didn't smile like he usually did, but his eyes shone with a steady light. "There was a time," he began, his voice steady and sure, "when I thought wearing a suit meant success. When I thought creating value meant turning a profit. When I thought changing the world meant having my photo in a business magazine. And then I realized, if you move so fast you never look back to see who's still with you, then getting there doesn't mean anything at all." No one spoke. Riley's hands tightened on her knees, her heartbeat slowing as if to match his words. "I'm not here to apologize," Noel went on, "because some mistakes can't be fixed with words. I'm here to show that redemption doesn't need forgiveness. It just needs to be lived, every day, through real work, with real people." He bowed his head slightly, stepped back, and left the stage. There was no applause, just a long, deep silence. The kind that fills a room when everyone knows they've just heard something true. Riley stood and walked out into the hallway. She needed air. She wasn't angry at him. What she felt went beyond forgiveness. It was the stirring of something she had long buried. The awareness of those who lived on the other side of the line, the ones she used to resent. A moment later, Noel stepped out too, keeping a respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," he said. He didn't try to explain anything more. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the exhibition room. "I wasn't testing you," Noel said after a quiet pause. "I was testing the last bit of faith I had left, that if I was honest, someone might still stay." Riley turned to face him. Her eyes weren't red, her voice didn't tremble, but what she said made the air between them go still. "I don't need a perfect man," she said slowly. "I need a real one. Someone who knows he's been wrong, and knows when it's time to start over." Noel didn't reply, but for the first time, Riley saw that the shame that had always shadowed his gaze was gone. In its place was something lighter, a quiet relief, as if he could finally breathe again. No more hiding. No more running. In the hallway, with footsteps echoing softly from the exhibition room, there was no longer any distance left between them that needed closing. Riley stood still, and she knew she wasn't going to walk away this time. Not because he was perfect, but because, for the first time, she'd met someone brave enough not to pretend to be anything more than human. On a Monday morning, the large room inside the art center buzzed with new energy. Freshly arranged tables and chairs filled the space, sheets of drawing paper and colored pencils neatly lined up on the shelves. Kids poured in, chattering excitedly, the first class of free art lessons for teens who had dropped out of school. Noel stood by the door, checking the lights and air conditioning. No suit, no business card, just a rolled-up shirt and the same worn shoes he'd worn back at the shelter. Riley was helping a little girl choose her colors. She looked over at him and smiled. He nodded back. No words were needed. Both of them knew they were beginning a journey with no roadmap, no lofty promises, but something real. Noel was no longer a millionaire. No more million-dollar meetings, no more dashboards to command or charts to control. He was learning how to live again, as an ordinary man. Starting from small things, listening instead of leading, rebuilding something not for achievement, but for the faith he'd once lost. Riley no longer carried the sharp edge she used to have toward people who'd once stood at the top. She no longer looked at them with judgment. She loved a man who had been there and had chosen with his own hands to step down. Not because anyone forced him to, but because his conscience couldn't bear it any longer. They didn't promise to change the world. They didn't talk about distant futures. They didn't need titles or labels for what they were. But each day, in teaching, cleaning, sharing simple meals, they chose one thing, that no matter how many scars they carried, no matter how slowly they moved, they would keep walking together to build something kind. When the kids burst out laughing after spilling paint all over the table, Noel wiped the stains from his shirt without a word of complaint. Riley pulled a chair closer and handed him a few paper towels. It was such a simple moment, the kind that could easily go unnoticed. Yet it was the quiet proof that sometimes the greatest act is simply choosing to stay. Not for an ideal, but for what's real. Some people come into your life not to make you believe in fairy tales, but to remind you that, despite mistakes, despite the past, it's still possible to believe in people. And that sometimes healing begins with something very small, choosing to walk together, even knowing the road will be long. That's where this story ends. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.